Hi, Guy. Can you hear me? Can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much for joining.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So today's session is all about you, a16z, and privacy Web3. We can't wait for you to tell us more about it. My name is Diane. I'm the social media manager from NIM. And can you introduce yourself, please?
Certainly. My name is Guy Wuollet. I'm an investment partner at a16z's Crypto.
It's amazing. I wasn't sure how to pronounce your name at first, whether it was Guy or Guy.
No, it's just like
I just if you get that.
the normal English word Guy. It's not quite as interesting as Guy, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, how are you today? Is it morning for you?
I'm doing well. Yeah, it is on the East Coast today. How about you, Diane?
I'm doing great. Also, I'm in the UK, so 3 p.m. here, just having my post-lunch coffee. So yeah, shall we get started?
Sure. Whenever you're ready. I don't know how long it takes for people to join, or if you'd rather wait a minute, but whatever is your preference.
We'll get started. Our spaces actually get recorded, so people can re-listen later, and we also upload them on YouTube as well. That's okay with you, of course. So yeah, let's get into it. I think this should take from 30 to 45 minutes approximately. Okay. So my first question is, could you give us a brief overview from your perspective of what Web3 is and why it's considered the next evolution of the internet?
Yeah, certainly. I'm happy to talk through that. Before I dive in, I should say that nothing I say here is legal, tax, or investment advice, and all of these are my personal opinions. And so I think what has excited me about Web3 or about crypto or whatever you might term it is the idea of decentralized networks. And especially when I think about NIM being the evolution of some prior projects, I like to think about things in terms of Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3. And I think there are two important axes or dichotomies that are worth emphasizing here. The first being the difference between a library and a network, where a library is a piece of static code. You can think of this as like a GitHub repo. I think Gnosis Safe is an excellent example in the crypto world, but a lot of the React templates or plugins might be a good example of a library in traditional programming. And a network is a piece of instantiated code that has some existing set of network effects, and where the value to the marginal user is increased based on the prior user's participation. So the value, if the 100th user receives from a network is greater than the first user, and the value the millionth user receives from the network is greater than the 100th, so on and so forth. And then I think that the second important distinction would be the difference between centralized and decentralized. In my framing, I think Web 1 was very much about decentralized libraries. So things like Git, like SMTP. Most internet protocols in the early days did not hold long-term state, but they were decentralized. No single organization, by and large, controlled them or had unilateral say over how they upgraded or were changed. And I think a lot of what made the internet, broadly speaking, successful for consumers was creating networks. And the only way to do that at the time was to create centralized networks. So something like SMTP turned into Gmail, and it became much more useful because now all of a sudden you didn't have to deal with spam. But the problem with that was that, of course, now it's very hard to run your own SMTP server to run your own email. I had a professor in college who did and was constantly fighting off spam as a result of the fact that purely running SMTP itself is very complicated today. And when I think about Web3, the promise, in my point of view, is the idea of building decentralized networks. So some stateful service that is not just a piece of code that you pass around, but is itself, containing valuable state, but not being controlled by a single entity, user, person, or in some case, government. And so I think that is how I conceive of crypto and of Web3. And happy to talk more about any of that, but that is sort of my usual framing.
Sure, thank you. And for yourself personally, what made you move forward towards Web3? Do you have a story, or is it just a personal interest for you?
Yeah, I think I got much more, I would say, seriously interested in crypto in the 2017 timeframe. And I remember I knew what Bitcoin was and had a friend who had spent some time programming on Ethereum, but I hadn't taken a serious look at it until around the holiday time. I was a student in college and studying computer science, and usually what I would get asked by my family around the holidays was to help fix the Wi-Fi or set up a new computer someone got as a gift or something like that. But my grandmother had asked me about Bitcoin because she kept seeing it on the news. I had no good answer for her. So I read the white paper and became pretty quickly enthralled. I think I read it every day for a week until I really properly understood it and became pretty quickly convinced that, one, it was kind of technically fascinating, but two, it very much aligned with my interests in trying to create more open and free systems on the internet. And so that was sort of my initial entree into crypto. And then I worked for a while after that on a project trying to create sort of a decentralized equivalent of BGP with the aim of preventing internet service provider or DNS provider from deplatforming Bitcoin or Ethereum nodes. At the time, that was something I was fairly concerned about, and I think still merits some concern, but perhaps I was just slightly too paranoid. But that was one of the things that had gotten me really interested in the networking level of crypto. And there are a lot of projects, I think, building at the application layer, building smart contracts, building end user applications. But for the most part, the actual peer-to-peer networking layer of crypto is unincentivized and is something that a lot of people overlook. And that's how I originally came across NIM, I think back in 2019, it would probably be.
Yeah. As an investment partner at a16z, you must see a lot of projects, I'm guessing, and be pretty aware of what's happening in the space. And actually yesterday was the 15th anniversary of the Bitcoin white paper. Don't know if you knew, but
Yes,
that was yesterday. Yeah. It's also funny that you mentioned your grandma asked you about Bitcoin, because I had the exact same experience. My grandma was very adamant about investing Bitcoin, even though my parents didn't even know about it. So I think they see it on the news. It's quite funny that this is happening. But yeah, okay, coming back to our conversation. So you mentioned that you learned about NIM through overlooking different projects from your time at a16z, right? And so I have to talk about privacy, right? And how crucial do you see privacy in the Web3 ecosystem, and how does it differ from the current state of privacy in Web2?
Yeah, I think privacy is obviously important, and it's something that perhaps gets overlooked because people who spend a lot of their either professional or personal hobbyist time, writing smart contracts or interacting with applications on chain, kind of take for granted the fact that everything is open and transparent, which seems like it will not work much longer term, especially for institutional adoption, as companies want to begin to participate on chain and feel very uncomfortable about putting employee payments or purchase orders or something like that transparent for the world to see. And I think the simple way of framing this intuitively is that almost no one has their salary published publicly, and very few companies transparently pay each employee. Your bank account, for example, is not something that your friends can go and look at. And, for example, the social features in peer-to-peer payment apps like Venmo are less utilized than you might have expected a couple of years ago if you had the thought that people wanted more of their financial activity to be public. And so I can't envision a world in which crypto and Web3 succeeds and there isn't a much more private set of smart contracts or platforms for people to interact with. I think that the part that is actually really crucial about NIM is that there have been a lot of folks and a lot of research into how to make applications private, primarily through the use of zero-knowledge proofs or trusted execution environments like SGX. But very few people have thought about trying to make networking private. And if you've looked at the state of sort of Web 2 internet surveillance, we already have encryption on all websites. And so most of the data that is collected, at least by folks like an intelligence service or a government, comes from metadata in the form of who am I talking to, not what am I specifically saying. And that sort of privacy, I think, will be very important in a crypto world where we're already starting to see some applications have privacy at the network level, probably best epitomized by threshold encryption and decryption for the purpose of avoiding MEV. But you might have seen yesterday, Celestial launched, and Osmosis had a lot of arbitrage bots, it seemed, at least, submitting transactions to try to have some statistical guess about the trade that they wanted to put on because they couldn't see precisely the state of the mempool. And this sort of privacy is very, very useful, but is incomplete. And I think of NIM as being privacy for the network level of crypto and providing true privacy, for lack of a better phrasing, to users and applications alike. And there are, existing alternatives that have some form of network level privacy. I think Tor is perhaps the best example, but Tor for a long time has had no native incentives, and so has run on the back of nonprofits and hobbyists and altruists who have contributed to it. And I think it's been very successful along those dimensions. But in a world where we, as the crypto industry, are trying to create better incentivized and open systems, it seems logical that there would be a network level privacy protocol for crypto that pairs nicely with a lot of the application level privacy projects that have been more and more successful over the past couple of years.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. And it seems like that will be the natural progression as we move on toward Web3 adoption. I like how you mentioned that privacy in Web3 will be really necessary for institutional adoption, because that's so true. And I think we don't mention this enough, actually. You mentioned that decentralized networks can better align incentives on the internet, like NIM, for example. So can you elaborate a bit more on this?
Yeah, certainly. I think one of the benefits of having a token is helping to solve the cold start problem. And the cold start problem refers to the fact that it's very hard to bootstrap a network effect because the value to the first user in joining a network is usually very low or in some cases zero. And so to convince the first couple of users to join, you often need to, quote, do things that don't scale in the Paul Graham framing. And later on in the network, when there are already a lot of users on the network, the value to a user is very large. And so there's actually a natural set of, there's some natural defensibility, and it's actually quite hard for users to pick an alternative because, a single product or network has such a strong effect. And you've probably seen this visualized as an S-curve before, where early on in the network, it's hard to convince users to join. And when the network is well established and mature, it's hard to convince users to leave. And so I think token can help solve this cold start problem at the beginning of a network by giving ownership of the network to people who participate in it. And I think about this in the sense of user-owned and operated networks as opposed to company or government-owned and operated networks. And that, I think, is an interesting, if not, at least in my personal opinion, I think that's a better model. But I think at a bare minimum, that is an interesting model that has not been well enough tried yet. And you see this in a lot of different computing domains. I think what happened with software-defined networking being adopted in the early 2010s around the idea of user or client-owned and operated networks, that sort of thing, while obviously not the same idea, is in some sense being adapted for crypto. And so in the case of NIM, I think a simple example of this is, today, if you think about the existing solutions for network level privacy, you have things like VPNs, or you have onion routing protocols like Tor and I2P. And VPNs, you pay a company to proxy your traffic for you. And so it has a lower level of security, a lower level of decentralization, and that company is a central point of failure. But there is at least a natural economic model for that. There's not really a natural economic model for something like Tor or I2P. And there is no incentive today for normal people to run exit nodes or to run nodes in Tor. Whereas with something like NIM, you can give people ownership in the network in exchange for having them run the network by running a mixed node. And I think that, one, helps to address this cold start problem of how do we convince people to participate early on, and then how do we ensure that the way the network grows over time is aligned with its users. But it also helps to just directly address the fact that there are some internet native protocols that probably ought to have had incentives for a while, and we've just lacked the money opcode on the internet. And that is kind of how I think about the value that decentralized networks can bring to core internet protocols and the utility of having a token.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. It's true that all the right conditions need to align, and that sometimes even if you have the solution, you don't have the funding and the conditions are not right. So it takes a lot, and I really hope that NIM will be able to provide this solution finally. So that brings me to my next question. How do you see platforms like NIM fitting into the Web3 landscape, especially as NIM focuses on privacy and metadata protection? You've already mentioned about this earlier. But yeah, overall, like fitting into the Web3 landscape, where do you see NIM?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two sort of obvious use cases for NIM in the short term. The first being, I already use a VPN or I already use Tor, and I would like an incentivized and more secure version. When I say more secure, I mean NIM is a mixnet as opposed to pure onion routing like Tor, and so NIM helps to avoid timing attacks. And a VPN, the VPN operator can see your traffic, and so that's obviously not as secure either as onion routing or as a mixnet. I think that's sort of the consumer use case of why would I as an individual load a NIM proxy up. I think that the second use case would largely revolve around applications in crypto that already have privacy at the smart contract or at the blockchain level, but don't have privacy at the network level. And I think a simple example of something like this is that like Zcash obviously aims to have private payments and private transfers, but there were a number of papers several years ago describing how if you could time when people were making deposits and withdrawals and make some simple assumptions about user profiles, you could actually de-anonymize a lot of the transactions on Zcash. And I think it was Sarah Meiklejohn who wrote this paper, if I'm recalling correctly. And something like NIM could naturally help avoid attributing the IP address of a transaction to the transaction itself, or naturally help avoid network level de-anonymization or privacy attacks. And so that I think is kind of the best set of use cases for NIM today, but the space is always evolving, and I would suspect we'll see more in the future as well.
Yes, about that. I believe that you focus on infrastructure and application layer investments in crypto, right?
Yes, I do a lot of our sort of decentralized network or infrastructure work on our team.
Okay, so you must see a lot of different kind of trends and projects. Can you share a bit about the trends or technologies that you've come across recently or over the past few years that you think are some of the most promising for the future?
Yeah, I think there are two broad categories of things that are particularly interesting to me personally. The first being what a lot of folks are calling DePIN now, or decentralized physical infrastructure networks. It's sort of amorphous how these are defined, whether you would include decentralized cloud services like compute, networking, and storage within this category, but I think it makes sense to today. And so from that point of view, NIM would be a DePIN project. The idea here really is that there is a lot of fundamental infrastructure, both internet infrastructure and roads, bridges, electricity, water networks that are fairly stagnant today and would benefit from competition or from innovation. And this whole category, I think, has particularly excited me. The original project that I think had convinced me it was a really interesting opportunity was Helium, who had deployed a lot of different LoRaWAN, which is a low-power networking standard, a lot of different LoRaWAN radios across the world. And I was always convinced that it would be very hard to convince end users to buy their own servers or to buy their own routers and to deploy a new wireless network from scratch using crypto incentives and tokens. And Helium, I think, was the first project to really prove that you could do this. And so there are now a bunch of projects taking this idea and trying to apply it more broadly. Many different wireless or backhaul networking projects. I think you would say that NIM would probably best fall into that category as a project focused on private transit and private routing for the internet. There are folks trying to build decentralized wireless networks like an Ethereum native version of Verizon or AT&T. You can think of projects trying to build new electricity or energy grids, projects trying to build decentralized transportation networks, which you can kind of think of as like Amazon's fulfillment network or something like Uber or DoorDash, but a version that is user owned and operated. And these projects, I think, are quite exciting because a lot of the incumbents here have not been well challenged for a long time. And the quality of service to end users is often pretty low. And so I think crypto has a real opportunity to make credible improvements to both fundamental infrastructure for everyone in society, but also to sort of the day in, day out experience of of being alive and someone who uses the internet in the modern day. I think the second category of projects that are personally exciting to me are zero knowledge proof projects. And at least in my opinion, I think, Carlotta Perez has a good framework. She wrote a book, I believe, called Technological Revolutions in Financial Capital. And she had described how different market cycles would often result in investment and funding directed towards a long tail technology that seemed sort of promising but not obvious. The investment made there would catalyze future tangible economic growth by having something very well adopted. And some of her examples were the steam railroad engine, the internet, the industrial revolution. And at least in my point of view, the most meaningful technology that has been funded over the last couple of years has been the incredible pace of improvement in zero knowledge proving. And I think there are two reasons you would care about this. The first would be for compression or for scaling, where you're not actually taking advantage of the zero knowledge component, but you're simply creating a validity proof, which is saying that I can run some computation and hand to you a piece of math, a piece of data, and it proves to you that I ran the computation correctly. And as a result, we can avoid forming classical BFT or Nakamoto consensus over a lot of computation, which I think will have incredible scaling benefits for blockchains. And the probably most popular common version of this is a zero knowledge rollup, which I imagine a lot of folks listening are familiar with. The second benefit is you can take those validity proofs and you can then make them zero knowledge, which means I can prove something to you without revealing to you any information about what I proved. And the intuitive example that I think is a good explanation is the idea of Where's Waldo. So I can take a big piece of paper, put it over a Where's Waldo book, and cut out just a large enough part of the paper to show you that Waldo was somewhere, in fact, on the page. But then I can take the paper away, close the book, and hand it to you. And when you open it again, you won't be able to spot exactly where Waldo is. So I can prove to you that Waldo exists, but I don't have to show you where exactly on the page he is. And you can take this idea for any computation, really. And this is the primitive that has been used to build a lot of the application level privacy protocols in crypto today, things like Zcash or Alio that have, I think, real promise to help improve the experience of using crypto. And so I think the two broad categories of projects that would excite me would be DePIN projects, decentralized physical infrastructure network projects, and then the second being projects using zero knowledge proofs like zero knowledge rollups.
Okay, thank you so much, and also for summarizing at the end. I'm curious because you must have seen over the past few years all these like new trends, new technologies, innovations coming up. So with the crypto boom and then small depression that's been happening over the past 2 years, can you tell us, have you seen, in terms of innovation, has it been going up? Is there a lot of innovation still happening recently? Or do you think the rate of innovation in the space has slowed down due to the market circumstances? I'm quite curious about how founders feel in this environment.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because I think sentiment is often not ground truth. And so the two pieces of content or example I would point folks to a number of years ago, Chris Dixon and Eddie Lazarin, who are two people that work on our team at a16z Crypto, had written a piece called The Price Innovation Cycle, predicting that when prices go up, it would create news and make people interested in crypto. Some of those people would dig deep and understand why the technology was interesting and then go on to build actual products and work on fundamental research and stay in the space as builders. And that thesis, I think, at least at the time that they had published the post, was surprisingly prescient in that most of the time when prices go up, people become more interested. They take a serious look at crypto. Some number of those people decide to focus their careers on it, and then they tend to stick around and to continue building despite any fluctuations in the market. And so I think that broadly has happened this time as well. And I would point people to the State of Crypto report that our team published, where we actually have some indices that try to break down fundamental indicators of progress in the space that are unrelated to price. Things like number of developers building, number of projects that have launched, how usable those products are. And those are, I think, probably much better metrics to track progress of technology than the state of a financial market. I think usually the financial market is probably not a good indicator of the pace of technical innovation. And so that is really how I would think about it. I would encourage people, if you're asking a question about innovation or technical progress, to look at the people doing research and writing code, as opposed to looking at like a market dashboard.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. I was recently reading about how a lot of people in the world believe that technology innovations is always happening, but that actually it will only happen if a lot of people are working on it at one time, and that we shouldn't expect just for new tech, new innovations to suddenly come out of the blue. So that made me think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those are true, and that innovation is always happening. But if you want it to continue happening, more people need to focus on making it so. And so, I think a lot of the fantastic improvements in life that have come out over the past couple of decades have been the result of a lot of hard work by a lot of people. And if we would like to continue to see that progress accelerate, then I would encourage everyone to take a serious look at, if you're not already working towards that future, doing so.
Yes, definitely. Okay, I'll move on to my next question. What are some of the biggest challenges you see in the widespread adoption of Web3 technologies, especially from a privacy standpoint?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge probably is simply around user adoption and experience. And part of this is like a social context or understanding around what is true and what is not. And so when I meet people who are relatively unfamiliar with crypto, oftentimes people will say, like, isn't Bitcoin used for privacy? Which is not correct, to be clear. Bitcoin does not provide any privacy about the transactions. In fact, the whole point is that all transactions are published publicly so that anyone anywhere around the world can validate that they're correct. And frankly, I think this is somewhat of an education problem of helping end users better understand and make the products more intuitive around displaying what is private and what is not private. Because I think usually when someone who's using a crypto product has a bad experience related to privacy, it's that an action they thought would be private was in fact public. That is a misconception or a misunderstanding, and the user does something they wouldn't want to be disclosed publicly. I think the other version of the set of challenges revolves largely around security. And security through obscurity is obviously not the best set of practices, but I think does occasionally work. And so part of the issues around privacy today in crypto, I think, are simply helping to make it more difficult for hackers to identify who is a potential target for some of these exploits. And I think some simple examples about this are just that if you are very public on Twitter talking about how you're excited about crypto projects, you are more likely to be a target for hackers. And so I think that has been one of the challenges. Like a simple version of this would be, it would be wonderful to have an ENS name available on Twitter, but not to have your address linked to that ENS name disclosed. And this is something that would be quite possible in theory with application level privacy in the future, but isn't quite there today. So I think a lot of the improvements that we'll see in the short term related to privacy will simply be better and more intuitive user experiences and better education about what is private and what is not.
Yeah, I definitely agree with this. And I think that's also true even in Web 2 in terms of user experience and user interface, in terms of successful products, that it's all the good ones that do success in the market. So yeah, as we wrap up, what's your vision for the next 5 years in the Web3 space?
That's that's a very broad question. I think it's hard to make any prediction over the 5-year period, simply because things can change so quickly. And I don't just mean this in the sense of market cycles, I mean this in the sense of technology. And so the example that has been most illuminating for me is a lot of the work done around DK EVM projects, zero knowledge rollups that want to have an EVM execution environment and want to create zero knowledge proof of correct execution. And back in the 2018 to 2020 timeframe, I think a lot of people thought building something like that would take a decade. And in a couple of years, we now have several live zero knowledge rollups, things like zk Sync, like Scroll and Tycho and Linea, like Polygon ZK EVM, that have all either in testnet or mainnet started to prove that you can in fact prove an EVM execution trace with a validity or a zero knowledge proof. And that has really simply demonstrated how much more quickly the technology improves, specifically how proving times decrease and proof sizes decreased at a rate that was faster than I think almost anyone had anticipated. And one of the jokes that I've heard a couple of people make is that zero knowledge proving is improving so quickly that in the future it will be faster to create a proof of some computation than to just do the computation itself, which is obviously farcical, but illuminates the idea that the pace of technical progress here has been really, really fast. And so when you say, what is the world going to look like in 5 years? I think it's very hard to predict, other than to say that I'm pretty excited about it. And I would encourage anyone who's interested or already working in crypto to keep building and to try to tune out the noise of people who are skeptical or doubting what you're working on, because I think this work is pretty essential for the future of functional and great society for people to live in. And when I think about why crypto matters, it's much more about the idea that we can let anyone propose new ways to organize people and networks and markets. And that, I think, is a deeply optimistic vision of the future, where the more people we have offering contributions, the better the world will be. And so that is kind of how I think about the future here.
Sounds amazing. I think you mentioned that already just now, but what advice would you give to projects and developers venturing into this domain?
Oh, I would just say keep building. I think technical improvements don't really change. And or what's a better way of framing this? The idea that progress is not really impacted by what other people have to say. And so I like doing Twitter spaces like this because I want to spread a positive and productive view of what's happening today in the crypto space. And I think occasionally things can become a little bit negative, which I assume is what you are alluding to. And a lot of the most meaningful technical improvements and innovation happen when what you're working on is not particularly popular. And so I wouldn't let the lack of popularity or hype in crypto today defer or deter anyone from focusing on what they love. And so I would encourage anyone who's not already working in the space to seriously consider it, and anyone who is to continue doing the good work.
Amazing. I love it. Keep building. Progress is not impacted by what other people have to say. It's perfect. I think it's a perfect note to end on. Do you have any closing comments?
No, just, it was wonderful to be here with you today, Diane. And I'm excited for the future of crypto and NIM.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Guy. We have much more exciting news at NIM to come out soon. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for tuning in today, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Thank you. Bye.